So I'm going to start with some autobiography that Sean's already mentioned, because it's in a way of trying to bring alive for you the reasons as to why my conception of the human condition ends up being at odds with much of mainstream psychotherapy, analytic, humanistic, as well as cognitivist. And although I will be saying a lot about racism in what follows, that is not the main subject of my talk. Racism is my means to the end, and the end being the subjects of internalism and individualism. So my first psychotherapy training was in the humanistic traditions, and it was a heady mix of Gestalt, TA, encounter, rebirthing, and so forth, mixed in with the thoughts of Jung, as well as Winnicott and Frank Lake. Now, the understanding of the human condition that I imbibed was that of the growth model. This being that we are each born unique, innocent, a seed, a pristine self. As this seed grows, it takes in values from the external world, values that are mostly alien to this true self. And these internalizations erode the uniqueness and authenticity. So in this way we lose touch with our true selves and develop a false self of some kind in order to become acceptable. And this might be becoming overly compliant, critical, fearful, and so on. And the purpose of therapy was to identify these extraneous injunctions, purge the psyche of them, and in so doing liberate the true self to live a more authentic life. The growth model takes it to be the case that it is a client who knows themselves best, and if a nurturing, non-interfering environment is provided, then their innate knowledge will find a way to naturally flower and express itself. Well, I found this training to be personally life-changing and deeply meaningful and helpful. However, on completion of the training, I started to become disenamored with its philosophy, which I came to think of as too me-centered, its vision neatly encapsulated in Fritz Perl's Gestalt prayer. I do my thing, you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations. You are not in the world to live up to mine. You are you and I am I. And if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped. The prayer evokes a picture of differentiated individuals with encapsulated psyches, who have the option of whether or not to relate to others. Now, the intention of humanistic philosophy is to empower. It said that you could be anything you wanted if you truly wanted it and if you were sincere in your efforts to manifest your desires. And the philosophy is undoubtedly empowering because it encourages you not to think of yourself as a victim. On the other hand, if you do not manage to get what you want, then this too is your fault. And this was extended to all levels of existence, including physical illness. If you got cancer, say, then somehow you must have wished it upon yourself for some unconscious reason. When a colleague's wife became distressed, having discovered that the sudden loss of sight in one eye was due to getting multiple sclerosis, she went to a counsellor. One of the first things the counsellor asked her was, "What is it you don't want to see?" I came to think that this philosophy was not only far too me-centered, it was also grandiose and omnipotent in its aspirations. During this time, this is the 1980s, I was a school teacher in London and becoming slowly politicized. My blundering attempts to articulate my half-formed thoughts were met with bafflement in the humanistic milieu that I was immersed in. It had no language for the political. Instead, there was the prevailing belief that individuals had the power to create the reality of their desires, that they were in charge of their own destinies. To this way of thinking, experiences of racism were somehow being generated by the individuals who were the recipients of racism. And it was said that although this experience was obviously unpleasant for them, it was suggested that nevertheless it served some unconscious purpose for this individual, secondary gain, as it is called. Unconvinced by this way of approaching racism, I looked first to Jung to help give voice to my growing preoccupations, because he had been venerated on the training. But it quickly became clear that Jung was not a part of the problem, that Jung was a part of the problem rather than a solution to it. He naturalized racism rather than problematizing it. For example, the European, however highly developed, cannot live with impunity among the Negroes of Africa. Their psychology goes into him unnoticed, and unconsciously he becomes a Negro. There is no fighting against it. In Africa, there is a well-known technical expression for this, going black. It is no mere snobbery that the English should consider anyone born in the colonies, even though the best blood may run in his veins, slightly inferior. There are facts to support this view. In case you hadn't picked it, Jung is not just talking about Africa, but also you folk here in Australia. So this was my first published work, which is a paper called The Racism of Jung. But moving on, I started a group analytic training in London, assuming that it would address some of my issues with the individualistic, humanistic psychotherapies. This it did do to some degree, but here too I was disappointed by its apolitical philosophy. And although I could not have articulated it at the time, the ethos of this institution was also individualistic. For example, I recall a fellow trainee saying that the sign of a successful group therapy was when the patient was able to be themselves and not be overly influenced by the wishes and desires of others. I knew what she meant, but even then it seemed to me that there was something wrong with this way of putting things, particularly on a training that promoted the group. So after that I started a more formal study of racism. And my first hope was psychoanalysis. But I was disappointed to find a mindset very similar to that of the humanistic traditions. I should not have been surprised, of course, because the fathers of the schools of humanistic psychotherapy, and they were all primarily fathers, in their first incarnation they were all psychoanalysts, and in their second incarnation they were disappointed psychoanalysts. But even as they distanced themselves from the conventions of classical psychoanalysis, they took with them much of its metapsychology. Disappointingly, this was also true to some degree of the progenitor of group analysis, S.H.Foulkes. So, trying to make sense of Foulkes for my purposes, I ended up making a distinction between a radical Foulkes, who drew more heavily on the sociology of Norbert Elias, and I made a distinction between a radical Foulkes and an orthodox Foulkes who drew his inspiration from Freud. And this was the basis of my first book, in which I started to try and develop a theory in order to try to understand racism. And the next two books are up there too. So it is through this trajectory that I became preoccupied with the themes of this presentation. This being psychology's myopic focus not just on the individual, but the individual's internal world. All this will become a bit clearer as I go on, as will be the reason that I think of them as tyrannies. So that's the end of the autobiography. I'll tell you what the rest of the paper is going to look like. So in what follows, I will begin with the question, how do the psychologies conceptualize racism? The answers will reveal the inadequacies of individualism and internalism. I will then address what has been called the relational turn, and I'll argue that its use mostly is in a weak sense, in that it is still individualistic. I will then build a stronger version of the relational, which places power relations at its centre. And last, I will think about some of the consequences of practice from this sort of perspective. So, how does psychology understand social difficulties like racism or any kind of marginalization process? There are three strands, each with their own philosophy: the instinctivists, the developmentalists, and the cognitivist, and I'll speak to each of them. The instinctivists, they're Hobbesian, and they're of the view that humans are born with hateful and aggressive instincts. And these natural destructive impulses are said to get ameliorated to some degree over time through the developmental process. Here we find Klein and the later Freud. This is a conflict model in more ways than one. Not only is there conflict within the psyche between the instinct, there is also conflict between the individual's wish to be unfettered and the constraints imposed on the individual by society. The developmentalists, meanwhile, are more with Rousseau and think that we are born good and damaged and made bad through upbringing and unfortunate life events. Here we find the growth model I alluded to earlier, in which the inherent goodness of the seed is contaminated by toxic processes intruding from the environment. The cognitivists conceive of the difficulties of human life in rationalist terms. They think that they are due to habituated errors of thinking, which when understood, free oneself to think and feel differently. Now I'm not an expert in TA, but my fleeting readings in TA lead me to think that the TA conceptualization of the human condition straddles the second and third strands, the developmentalists and the rationalists. Now, in what follows, I'm going to speak mainly to the psychoanalytic version of things rather than the humanistic or the cognitive. In part because of time, in part because this is a stream that I have studied most deeply, but also because in part recognizable versions of the same issues are echoed in the other schools of therapy. So I'll begin with the classical psychoanalysts and my dispute with their version of things. Here are some of the things that the progenitors of psychoanalysis have said. For example, Klein, the understanding of the individual's personality is a foundation for the understanding of social life. Or, all sociological problems are ultimately reducible to problems of individual psychology, and so on. So according to this view then, although racism might manifest as a sociological problem in the external world, its source is to be found in some difficulty in the internal world of individuals, an internal difficulty which is externalized. I presume you're already beginning to hear some echoes with your way of thinking. Broadly, there are three sorts of explanations provided by the psychoanalysts, versions of which are found in the humanistic therapies. These are the mechanisms of projection, early developmental malfunction, and recapitulation. And I'll speak to each of these. So the idea of projection is at the root of almost all psychoanalytic explanations of interpersonal and societal difficulties. And in a way, it's a very simple theory. There's something in the individual which they can't tolerate for whatever reason. It's denied, it's split off, it's repressed, and it's projected into some other individual or being. Now, this other individual or group or whatever it is comes to be experienced as holding this attribute which has been split off and projected into them, say aggression. Well, this theory does work, but in a limited way and at the level of a particular individual. This theory would explain why it is this or that individual comes to hold hateful feelings towards blacks or some other group of people. What it does not do is explain how and why a whole group of people should simultaneously come to hold hateful feelings towards other groups. Nor is it clear why in one context it should be black people as receptacles, in another context Protestants, and in another context, perhaps here, the psychoanalysts. One sort of answer put forward in the psychoanalytic literature to these sorts of challenges is that these groups have been previously socially sanctioned as deserving of these projections, and so they are already denigrated. I think this is true, but the answer actually avoids the central issue, which is how do these groups come to be socially sanctioned as deserving of these and being denigrated in the first place, and why? So in sum, what the projection theory does is to say that psychological mechanisms of individuals exploit pre-existing social conditions to manage internal psychological difficulties. It does not engage with the problematic of how and why these social conditions come to be generated in the first place. And as Littlewood and Lipset said a long time ago, projection is a mechanism, it is not an explanation. Well, if projection is a mechanism, then what are the sources of the internal tensions that are requiring ejection from the psyche? One source of tension is the conflict between the instincts. The other source of tension is articulated by the stream that includes psychoanalysts like Winnicott and Bowlby, as well as the humanistic traditions, and it is to this I will speak next. This line of thinking is of the opinion that rather than the instincts, it is the child's early nurturing environment that plays a key role in the kind of person that the child grows up into. Broadly, loving homes are more likely to cultivate loving adults, and contrariwise, harmful environments damage children and produce adults that have difficulties in life. Now, even whilst this way of thinking makes a lot of sense, and actually it accords closely with my way of approaching things, this too is an explanation at the level of individuals. It might tell us how this or that person's developmental history has given rise to his or her attitude to some outgroup. But for this explanation to work at a societal level, it would have to be the case that the developmental malfunctions of large numbers of people in societies would have to be closely synchronized. Surely this is not something very likely. Nor does this way of thinking account for those who have grown up in good enough environments who also end up developing negative attitudes towards outgroups. Now, mostly, when psychology troubles to look at the issues of racism, it tends to keep its focus on the mindset of the racist. Very rarely does it give attention to the recipients of these dynamics. And when it does, then here too, it tends to locate the cause of the recipient's experience of racism in the recipient. For example, the Swedish psychoanalyst Bashkare thinks that her African patient's deep feeling of being worthless whenever the theme of stranger was brought up were to be found in his experience of weaning and with his Oedipal conflict. The fact that he was unable to advance in his job is explained by the state of his internal world. No space is given to the possibility that components of his worthlessness might have to do with particular experiences of living as a black man in Sweden. I have an allied, more recent example regarding a trainee some years ago on the group analytic training in London. He was a British-born UK citizen and Anglo-Indian, and he was being constantly stopped on both borders as he travelled between the UK and his holiday property in France. Complaining about this in his group analyst thought that as he worked through his childhood issues, this was less likely to happen. There is one other reason proposed by psychoanalysis as to why we behave in these problematic ways towards outgroups. In this scenario, nothing wrong need have happened in childhood. Instead, what happens is that normal childhood developmental stages get inappropriately reactivated in adulthood. One such instance of this is stranger anxiety, which is something that all infants go through at around the age of 6 months. Some think that in meeting strangers in adult life, this infantile constellation gets reactivated, which is why we end up fearing strangers in adult life. All I have to say to this is, we don't react with fear to all forms of strangeness. And not all adults react in this way to strangers, which we would expect to be the case as we have all gone through this developmental stage in infancy. As I conclude this section, I want to flag up a caveat. My intention is not to dismiss all psychoanalytic accounts of social phenomena out of hand, but to point out their limitations. I find notions of projection and so forth essential and invaluable in my clinical work. However, when they are put forward as the only explanations, when they pose as complete explanations, then they lose what value they have and they become dangerously reductive, in which case they do not so much explain as explain away. On the whole, the humanistic traditions don't have much to say on processes of marginalization, and when they do, they tend to individualize it and put forward some version of contamination to be the cause. As will be well known to members of this conference, TA thinks that racism is caused by the adult being contaminated by elements from the parent, child, or both at the same time. This is how one TA commentator puts it. Contamination from the parent is typically manifested through prejudiced ideas and attitudes. Contamination from the child involves distorted perceptions of reality. When contamination by the adult by the parent and child or both exists, boundary work is called for so that demarcation of each ego state can be clearly drawn. When the ego state boundaries are realigned, the person understands his or her child and parent rather than being contaminated by them. There seems to be a consensus in the TA literature that I have come across that the racialized ideations reside in the parent, capital P, and the emotional charge of, say, repulsion reside in the child. As one researcher put it, prejudice is a parent contamination and delusions are child contaminations. I find this kind of explanation somewhat simplistic as well as implausible. Not a popular thing to say into this audience, I'm sure. And even if the psyche operated in this discontinuous way, the explanation for how these states of mind arise is individualistic. Notice as well, the focus is on states of mind, not on lived reality. It is a description of how this individual comes to hold these attitudes by something leaking into their capital A adult via their parent. We are told that these ways of thinking come to reside in the capital P parent through the attitudes emanating from the actual parents. But if we ask how did these attitudes come to reside in the actual parents in the first place, we find ourselves trapped in an infinite regress. We are mired in a similar difficulty to the one we came across with the theme of psychoanalytic projection. This might possibly be an explanation of how racism is transmitted between generations. But even if it were, it says nothing about why it arises in the first place, nor how it comes to reside in society at large. These days, almost all schools of psychotherapy have woken up to the reality that Rousseau's noble savage, a solitary individual living in blissful union with nature, never existed. They declare themselves relational, and many claim that they were the first to take the relational turn. In doing so, they reveal and declare that in their earlier manifestation, they were non-relational, that is, individualistic. But in most cases, despite the alleged turn, mostly what relational is taken to mean is individuals in relation to other individuals. In other words, this is a picture of a pre-existing individual relating to another pre-existing individual. This is the lesser or weaker meaning of relational, and it is still fundamentally individualistic. The TA take on relationality seems to me to be of this kind. Pre-existing distinct individuals engage in a series of transactions between each other. Now, those, and I imagine that means you, who hold this line are likely to take umbrage at my portrayal and say that this theory is actually deeply psychosocial, because of course the psyche is influenced by society, and so of course societal norms influence the individual. Well, yes and no for the following reason. Most psychological theories make a tacit or explicit distinction between the processes of development and the processes of socialization. The processes of development are talked about as though it were a natural psychobiological process taking place between carers and infants. Socialization, meanwhile, is thought to occur later, when this partially developed child starts to absorb societal norms. Many theorizations that would characterize themselves as psychosocial are of this kind. This is most clearly seen in Freud. Before the Oedipal stage, the child is embroiled in this developmental process. Then at about the age of 5, this already formed psychobiological being takes in societal norms and forms the superego. Two things here. First, the social residing in the superego remains distinct from the biological residing in the id. Second, the individual and the social remain distinct entities. Notice, the social is entering the individual. The humanistic traditions too have their versions of this distinction. For example, the distinction between the self-concept and organismic self in person-centered theorizations. The self-concept, consisting of injunctions and attitudes taken from the outside, are thought to be at odds with the natural values of the organismic self. There is something similar in TA2, with its construction of parent, adult and child, its notion of contamination, and so on. There are 2 points I want to underline. First, all these ways of thinking are descriptions of individuals in society, suggesting that the individual and the social are different levels of existence. Second, to one degree or another, they all infer that there exists some kind of pre-social natural self which is thought to get corrupted by the social. What I'm going to do next is to build a deeper theorization of the relational. Now, common sense presents existence to us in this sort of a way. It seems to us that obviously the material world exists first. After all, the earth existed before people. An individual is born into this world. Later, this individual joins other individuals to create society. Now, when this autonomous rational individual explores the worlds of things, which is the left-hand side, that's called science. And they find that they're able to control the world in relatively predictable ways. But when this individual gets together with other individuals on the right-hand side, then things become uncontrollable and unpredictable, and people behave in irrational and destructive ways. The right-hand side is decreed to be the territory of politics, and the left-hand side that of science. In this schema, the activity of science, which is said to be value-free, is thought to be distinct from that of politics, which is value-laden. In this sort of picture, it is possible to say, keep politics out of sport or science. It is possible to say, politics has no place in the activity called psychotherapy. It is notoriously difficult to control social life. Rationally, plan to do one kind of thing, and no matter how hard we try, something unruly almost always seems to take place. Why is social life so unpredictable and seemingly irrational? Freud famously said that this was because our conscious rational intentions are being driven and disrupted by unconscious intentions and desires. He says, when individuals come together in a group, all their individual inhibitions fall away, and all the cruel, brutal and destructive instincts which lie dormant in individuals as relics of a primitive epoch are stirred up to find free gratification. TA thinks that people behave in these unhelpful ways because the adult has been contaminated by elements of the parent and child, or that they are acting out old scripts, playing games, reinforcing rackets, and so on. TA suggests that once the individual is freed from these, they will become more rational and their unhelpful inclinations will disappear. Meanwhile, the Gestalt prayer suggests that if an individual does not like what happens when they engage with other people. They can simply opt out. Much of organizational theory, beginning with Taylor's scientific management, tries to apply the principles of rationalist natural science to control the employee through a mix of contracts and procedures. And when these don't work, they simply produce even more of the same. The contemporary manifestation of this worldview is that of new public management. Before I leave this picture, there are a few things worth underlining. First is that in this sort of schema, society is optional. Individuals have a choice whether or not to interact with others. Second, it would appear that the interests of society are in conflict with the interests of the individual. Third, although this way of thinking allows the social and cultural to influence the individual, ultimately they remain distinct from each other, with society as something beyond and outside the individual. And finally, a question for you in passing. Where is the therapist to be located in this picture? Where is the client? But what if we redraw this picture, beginning not with the material world, not with the individual, but the social? This sequence, starting with the social, actually makes better sense from the perspective of each unique individual, because each of us is born into a pre-existing society. The social is the domain of power relations and the conflictual political. If we begin here, as I think we must, then all that follows from it will of necessity be permeated by power relations and politics. This is not just so for the individual psyche, but all human activity, including that of science and psychotherapy. As the infant develops, it cannot help but imbibe the discourses that it is born into, discourses which come to constitute the self. Notice, it is not the case that a pre-existing self internalizes the social. Rather, the self comes to be constituted through this psychosocial developmental process. The fabric of the self is social, and one cannot be abstracted from the other without rendering them both meaningless. There is no part of the psyche that is prior to or outside the social. This is what the group analyst Foulkes is alluding to when he said, "This social influence is not added to the individual in a superficial or secondary way, but thrust down to its roots." Linear language cannot capture the complexity of this recursive non-linear process that we call infant development, and neither does my diagram from earlier. This then is the stronger, deeper meaning of the term the relational. In terms of development, it is not the case that pre-existing selves relate to each other. Rather, these selves are constituted out of relationships. We should add relationships which are already politicized. Or to put it most strongly and counterintuitively, the relationship is prior to that which relates. Selves are precipitates of relationships. As the milieu that the infant imbibes is politicized, the psyche will also be politicized from the first moments. Therefore, in my view, there is no possibility of getting back to an apolitical, pristine, natural self or apolitical adult, because there is no such entity in the first place. Peter Fonagy says that the child comes to form its sense of self through internalizing the picture in the parent's mind of the child's state of mind. He says that this is the mechanism through which the child comes to form the ego sense of him, the core sense of himself. However, the mother does not just experience a baby per se, but a particular kind of baby. She, like all of us, will be led to a particular way of experiencing the world according to the conventions written into the discourses we inhabit. It seems to me that the caregiver gives back to the infant something much more than a picture of the infant's state of mind as it exists in the caregiver's state of mind. the caregiver is also giving back to the infant the caregiver's attitude to that infant, boy, girl, light, dark, fat, thin, and so on. And this in turn comes to inform the growing infant's attitude towards itself. Another name for this attitude is self-esteem. In other words, the image of the self that the infant takes in from the caregivers is from the first intrinsically social. In part, by virtue of its attributes, it finds itself situated and positioned in the caregiver's affections, and so comes eventually to, and similarly, to situate and position itself. If we accept this, then it follows that in attaching to persons, we are also, of necessity, attaching to social categories, however subliminal our sense of them might be, and that these social categories are integral to the sense of self. Well, to this complex picture, it's in fact, the situation is even more complex, because the infant is not just born into one discourse, but multiple overlapping and conflicting discourses. We are each born into milieus that are constituted by a range of we's, each with their own way of being, each with its own ethical sensibility. The infant, therefore, is subjected to a variety of gazes, each one of which position the infant differently. The discourses themselves, as well as the relationships between them, are constituted by power relationships. As each of us grows, we imbibe the conflictual mix of cultural norms that we are born into, and which come to form the self. Most importantly, what this means is that the self is not a sublime homogeneity, but a conflicted unity, in a state of tension arising out of the conflictual aims of the varieties of we one is born into. So, we can say on this basis that the I, the me, is constituted at the deepest of levels by and through the power relationships that are a part of the social fabric that we are born into. If I were forced to use the language of the true self, I would have to say that there are a number of true selves which are in conflict with each other. In allying myself with one kind of we, one is inevitably betraying another aspect of the self which is allied to another we. There is no restful, comforting singularity to retreat to, as many humanistic traditions imagine being the case. We have never lived in the Garden of Eden. In sum, the we is prior to the I. The I is constituted by the mix of we's that one is born into. The social relationship is prior to that which relates. The self is precipitated out of these relationships. The self is a conflicted entity and constituted by diversity. If we follow this way of thinking, then the previous utterances of the classical psychoanalysts are reversed. And we read it like this, and we can say that the understanding of social life is a foundation for the individual's personality, or all problems of individual psychology are ultimately reducible to sociological problems, and so on. But in making this reversal, I'm not wanting to replace internalism with externalism, which would be the opposite error. What I want to point to is hard to point to, actually, because this very way of speaking has already bought into the internal-external dichotomy, as well as the division between psychology and sociology. Apolitical individualism continues to hold sway in the world of psychotherapy, despite the fact that much before Marx, even somebody like Thomas Aquinas, hardly a revolutionary left-wing radical, had already said that man is by nature political, that is, social. How is it that we come to experience and think of the social and the individual as two different levels of existence? Foulkes offers a helpful analogy. Imagine we are each driving cars on our particular journeys. In this, we are akin to autonomous individuals. but soon we cannot move. It now appears to us that there is something outside me that is acting against me, preventing me exercising my autonomy. The name we give this kind of experience, an experience that we actually help to create, sustain, and remain integral to, is called a traffic jam. This is also true of the entity called society. The curious thing is that although we constitute it, we come nevertheless to experience it as something outside us, alien to us, and acting against us. Norbert Elias too dissolves this dichotomy. He says, human society is a level of nature. And he continues, humans are by their nature made for a life with each other, a life which includes interpersonal and intergroup struggles and their management. I'm going to speak now to the theme of power relations. Elias tells us that power relations are an aspect of all relationships, and it is so because we are interdependent on each other. Interdependence is another name for function or need. To say that a person A has a function for person B is to say that B needs A. If B needs A, we can say that A has power over B. However, the reverse will also be true. Hegel famously showed that the slave was not entirely powerless, and the master needed the slave, even if it were only in the minimal sense of needing to keep the slave alive in order that they may exploit them. So one can see then that the relationship between A and B is interdependent, even whilst it is bound to be asymmetric. Power is first and last a relational attribute, and in speaking in this way, we are politicizing the notion of the relational. On the basis of this sort of account, not only do I come to think that the practice of psychotherapy is an intrinsically politicized activity, I also come to think that it is a work in ethics. Now, all this while, I have not made specific mention of the theme of this conference, the power of group dynamics. Mainly, I've been talking about the social rather than the group. The two are not the same. There is a danger, however, that in speaking of the power of group dynamics, one is seduced into thinking that this power can be appropriated and put to a predetermined use. Some might try to develop techniques to harness the power of group dynamics for particular ends. Here we would find the twin notions of mastery and master practitioners. The view that it is possible and desirable to utilize sets of practices to master one's own psyche as well as those of the dynamics of the group. In my view, this sort of idea of mastery is sheer hubris, and this is why I think this. Some years ago, I was one of the more vocal members of staff at a group event, prompting, highlighting, naming dynamics, asking questions, and so on. After the session, a colleague said to me that he noticed that my interventions did indeed elicit responses from the membership. But mostly, the response had very little to do with whatever I just said. At that time, I experienced this reflection as an attack on me, and I dismissed it accordingly. But later I came to realize that his comment was in fact very useful, because it pointed to the non-linearity of group dynamics. What was taking place was analogous to the butterfly effect, that well-known characteristic of chaos theory. A small perturbation here, a butterfly flapping its wings in Chile, triggers a seemingly unconnected and surprisingly big effect there, a typhoon in China. Person A says something innocuous to B, and C suddenly breaks down in inconsolable grief. But chaos theory is in fact a deterministic theory, in that it presumes that the effect just looks random and chaotic. But if one had enough information about the details of the system, one could in principle be able to calculate and predict this apparently chaotic outcome. However, it turns out that humans and human interaction function not in accordance with chaos theory, but complexity theory. in which outcomes cannot be deduced and predicted, even in principle. The key terms here, The key terms here are nonlinearity, emergence, and unpredictability. And out of the three, the most important is emergent, which says that novel and unpredictable dynamics arise and emerge through the interactions between group members. When we see something new and surprising, we tend to ask, where did this novel thing come from? And we're inclined to think that it must have come from somewhere. And mostly we think that this somewhere is the internal psychological world of individuals. No doubt there is some truth to this, but it is not the only truth, and nor is it the complete truth. The notion of emergence stands in contrast to this convention to say that the novel has not come from somewhere because it did not exist a moment ago. It was literally created by and through the interactions. It is a truism to say that all human life takes place in groups. However, we also know that to live and work in groups is fraught with difficulty and sometimes impossibility. It is this reality that has misled many to think that the difficulties arise because the social is antagonistic to the essence of the individual. In contrast, in the company of Foulkes, Elias and others, I've been putting forward the view that this individual is intrinsically social in his or her being, social to the core. This does not mean that the social stamps individuals to create clones. We are each unique, but as the biologist Cronin has said, there is nothing unique about being unique. Nevertheless, we are still left with the question, if our nature is social, then why do we have such difficulties with others as well as with ourselves in relation to others? I will come at this question through the Fuchsian notion of belonging. Fuchs tells us that a sense of belonging is intrinsic and necessary to psychological well-being. The opposite of belonging is alienation, and between the two are all the difficulties of human existence. But belonging is not straightforward, nor is it a guarantor of well-being. We all belong to families, and yet for almost all of us, our families of origin were also to some degree the source of profound unhappiness. Our natural tendency is to group, but this tendency is patterned by the power relations one is mired in. And this happens in a number of ways. So first, whether we recognize it or not, whether we can admit to it or not, it is the case that we are drawn to the more powerful, and our unconscious inclination is to group with them, with the in-group. Power is charismatic. Quite literally, power is sexy. Second, the notion of belonging requires that its negations also be potential realities, which is that in belonging to one thing, there is another thing that I do not and cannot belong to. And second, that only some are allowed to belong. Without these two conditions, belonging becomes all-inclusive and so meaningless. In other words, the sense of belonging arises in and through intersecting processes of inclusion and exclusion. Belonging is not a state, but a moment in an ongoing process. But it is also the case that we cannot not belong. One could say that the purpose of group therapy is to generate a particular kind of belonging for group members, and this struggle to belong or not to belong is of itself the process of therapy. But if I cannot mould or direct the power of the group, if group processes are uncontrollable and unpredictable, then what on earth is it that I'm being paid to do as group therapist? Kierkegaard is helpful here. He famously said, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." I think all therapy, including group therapy, is like this. One could characterize the group as a space in which things happen in order that they be understood, but they can only be understood retrospectively. Earlier, I underlined the fact that group processes, by which I mean interactions between individuals, produce continual novelty. But it is also true that individuals and group dynamics reproduce the same scenarios over and over again. Freud spoke of this conservative inclination as repeating without remembering, which is recast in TA language as games people play. We can characterize the process of group therapy as facilitating a movement from the stuck and habituated towards a novel. But this entails a movement from the familiar to the unfamiliar, from the known to the unknown, and it creates anxiety. And here is the thing. I think it creates anxiety in the therapist as much as the client, precisely because it is unknown to both. This further underlines why the idea of mastery is bankrupt. Mastery entails directing a process towards a preconceived end, towards something that is already known, whereas therapy is a journey into the unknown. The unknown is frightening precisely because there is no guarantee that what emerges will be benign rather than malign. So my role as group therapist is improvisational rather than technique-driven. Even though group processes are unpredictable, I engage and improvise with intentionality. More and more, my intention is to merely notice and name what I notice. However, what I notice is not by any means a neutral, detached, value-free activity. Nevertheless, more and more, my intention is to be rather than to do, and to be with rather than do to. The democratic ideal I aspire to is captured in Foulkes' statement that group analysis is a form of psychotherapy by the group, of the group, including its conductor. This requires that I be transparent in my interactions with what is arising in me in relation to the ones who come for help. It requires that I do not conceive of myself as a detached therapist who is giving some form of treatment to the client, but as a responsive participant in the process. If one error is for the therapist to think of themselves as the expert, the other error is to think that it is the client who is the expert. Whilst I do not have privileged access to objective reality, nor subjective reality, neither does the client. It is the interaction between the mix of things that sometimes something magical takes place. I say magical because we would be hard put to say with any confidence why something has occurred. All we are able to do is to marvel and create post hoc rationales and rationalizations. But within these democratic aspirations there remain critical asymmetries, born of the fact that I am the one who's being paid to help. I am there in the service of others rather than myself. So let me conclude by attending briefly to the term tyranny. The belief that the internal psychological world is the source of our experiential world has a tyrannical grip on our mindset in this profession. Whilst this belief is presented as science, it is in fact ideological. It is the fact that the dominant discourses determine not only what we are able to see, but also what we are able to think about it is what makes it a tyranny. Ruling paradigms bind us to the normative unconscious and blind us to the existence of alternative possibilities. As ever, observation is theory-laden. Our trainings teach us to read everything back into the psyche, and when we don't, the orthodoxy in our profession think it to be an error and acting out on the part of the therapist. Tyrants decree how the world is and brook no alternative. Voice something that goes against the ruling paradigm, and the tyrant's response is likely to be punitive. And one of the most feared of punitive gestures is to be made an outcast and be cast out beyond the pale, no longer allowed to belong. For example, the response of some colleagues, thankfully not all, to my first book, Taking the Group Seriously, was to dismiss the work as not psychoanalytic, and in so doing they cast me out of that territory. What they actually meant was that the work did not accord with their individualistic and internalist conception of the psychoanalytic. We are then embroiled in a power struggle regarding the psychoanalytic. What does it mean? Who claims it? who is allowed to belong. This is also the case for the term psychotherapeutic. Today, everywhere in the world, the baleful forces of neoliberalism are feeding on the individualism already present in the zeitgeist, further atomizing our already broken world. That is the thing about individualism and internalism. It depoliticizes existence itself. For me, this power struggle is deeply ideological, deeply passionate, and deeply meaningful, precisely because it is a power struggle for what it means to be human. Thank you.